was a bright November day, but it was bitterly cold. You know, when the wind is just freezing? And I was standing in the sun, but standing in the wind, hoping that the numbness in my ears and my nose would extend to my heart, that I could just freeze myself for a little while. Because I didn't want to feel what I was feeling, because the heartache was immense, because I'd made a decision and I hadn't realized that it would be this moment in my life where nothing would be the same again. You think you know sometimes what you're getting yourself into, but sometimes you just don't. And maybe I hadn't calculated the cost correctly, or maybe it's just how life is. But I didn't know until then that you could grieve so hard for a past for which you couldn't return to. And I wonder if you've had those moments too, where maybe it's because life dealt you something, a death, a relationship breakup, a fracture, or a choice that happened, a job change or a move, where whatever was, something has shifted, and what will be is not the same. And I think that's where we find Martha in our story today. Martha and her sister Mary and their brother Lazarus, they're longtime friends of Jesus, almost from, I guess, the beginning of his ministry. They're deeply together. They're deeply friends. It's important to know that for this story. And Lazarus has fallen ill. And so the natural thing Martha and Mary do is send word to Jesus, the one that you love he's very ill. It's the first century. It's not like Cleveland Clinic's down the road. But Jesus has a reputation for healing lots of people, so surely he will come. One day, 2 days, Lazarus dies. And Martha, her brother, they all live together. Mary and Martha aren't married. Her brother dies. And so it's not just the absolute heartache of losing your brother too young. Maybe you've been there. It's the heartache, too, of losing everything about her life that was and would be. All of her economic safety, all of her safety in general. It's gone. But I think she's mostly weeping because she loves her brother, and he's gone. And I think she's probably deeply upset at Jesus. I sent you word. Bethany is how far away? Why didn't you come? And so she feels the abandonment of her. I don't know if you felt like that. I stood in that November wind, and I'd made a decision a lot because I thought that it had something to do with God. That's kind of how this job goes. You have some agency, you don't have all the agency. I felt so deeply abandoned. I thought, come on, man. Where are you? Come on, God. You didn't show up. You didn't show up at all. And I think that must be how Martha feels in this story. And then finally, Jesus does come. He comes finally. He walks into the middle of the mess, into the middle of the grief. And Martha hears that he's coming. And if you know Martha from other stories, this woman, she's not trifling. She's about her business in the world. So unlike Mary, who's kind of the yin and yang of Martha, Mary stays to weep. Martha's like, yeah, no, I'm going to meet him on the road. And so she hitches up her skirt and walks at a good clip to find Jesus, carrying all of her anger, carrying all of her questions to find him on the road. And she shows up to him. She says, you know, if you had been here, if you'd been here, he wouldn't be dead right now. And I imagine that the cascade of tears is real, because anger is always masking something. And anger in this case it's masking Martha's deep, deep sorrow at her brother's death, and also her deep, deep feeling of betrayal by Jesus. So she just weeps. And Jesus says, you got to read it with gentleness. Jesus says, he'll rise again. And Martha's like, yeah, I don't want a theological conversation right now. I know at the last day he's going to rise again. Come on. He's dead now. And Jesus in the Gospel of John, right, always reminds us that he carries the name of God, and he says, I am resurrection, and I am life. Do you believe that, Martha? And something about the conversation shifts at this point. It's no longer about Martha's grief. It's this moment, like so many in the Gospel of John, where Jesus shows up to someone and invites them to make a response. And I imagine that Martha, the tears stop because the gravity of the moment has shifted. What does she believe about Jesus? And she summons the depths of who she is. She's known Jesus for a while. Him asking her in this moment is not taking advantage of someone in their grief. It's not as if Jesus has caused Lazarus to die. But now he's here, and he's, out of the depth of the relationship the two of them have, asking Martha what she really thinks about all of it. Who does she think he is? So Martha stands there and summons out what she knows about Jesus. All the conversations they've had, all the times he's been at her table, all the moments she knows that Jesus loves them. And the text tells us that. Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And is it enough? Is it enough for Martha to know that Jesus loves her and her brother and still didn't show up in the way that Martha wanted him to? And for Martha it is. Unlike in the other Gospels, it's not some guy and it's not Peter, it's Martha who makes the first confession. I believe that you are the Son of God, the Messiah. I believe that to be true. It's not a trivial moment. She says that about Jesus in the midst of immense pain, and she's decided to trust the goodness of God, even though the empirical evidence in the moment is a little bit questionable. And I gotta tell you, this text made me mad all week. I don't normally tell you things like that, but I felt a little frustrated because I wanted there to be some kind of answer. Like, why does Jesus not show up until after Lazarus is dead? It makes me mad. Maybe that's how I read Martha. Because I guess it makes me mad when Jesus doesn't show up when I think that Jesus should show up. I hate being in hospital rooms when people are dying too young. It makes me angry. I hate senseless violence. I hate the suffering that I see in the world. Jesus just doesn't always show up on my timeline. I find it interesting whether I have the heart or not, like Martha does, to look at the rest of the evidence of who Jesus is. Then do I have the right to demand that God show up in the way that I want God to show up on my timeline? Jesus knows more than I know. Jesus knows more than Martha knows in this story. Jesus has the infiniteness of God. And I admire that Mary trusts that. Trusts the love of Jesus for her and her family, despite the fact that God didn't exactly show up in the way that she wanted. I wonder about that for us. But Jesus does show up. And Martha offers her confession. And Jesus says, "Where is he?" And in this powerful moment, Jesus and Mary and Martha and all of their friends and community go to the tomb, and Jesus weeps. He loved Lazarus. He loves Mary and Martha. He's come to the world because God so loved it. And I think what Jesus knows is that death happens to everything that's living. Everything, every tree, every squirrel, every human. Death happens. And God doesn't offer an easy answer about it. And sometimes I think this story is here because Jesus doesn't just go and resolve it, but he sits in the heartache and he weeps with Mary and Martha. But then he's God, and in the infiniteness of God, he decides that while it is light, he will do the works of God. While he's present on the earth, he'll do something about present time death. And so he says, roll back the stone. And I love that it's Martha that says, reality check, reality check. He's been in there for a while. Just gonna, let's not open it. No, let's not. And I love that because she's just said he's the Messiah, he can do anything. And now she's like, let's not test that. And faith is like that, isn't it? Trust in God is not as self-evident or as easy as it seems. But Jesus prevails and they roll away the stone, and I have this moment where like everyone there, women grab for their scarves, right? The men turn away their heads. It's awful. But everyone has to know that Lazarus was dead as a doornail. The story doesn't work if there's any doubt that Lazarus isn't entirely, absolutely dead. The smell tells you so. So everyone's kind of like, ooh, all right, here we go. And Jesus says into the darkness after praying, Lazarus, come out. Can you imagine being there? You imagine being Martha? Staring into the darkness of the tomb, into the stench, into death? I don't think it's immediate, right? There's got to be a moment where the breath of God fills Lazarus and his lungs move again. And his heart begins to pump, and the blood begins to move, and the decay begins to reverse. And so everyone's standing there for a second, staring. And then out he comes. Can you imagine? He's wrapped super tight. He can barely move. He comes into the light. And you might expect Jesus to go forward. But he doesn't. He looks at everybody else, turns to Martha and Mary and the crowd, and he says, unbind him. Let him go. And you could see it as Jesus not finishing the thing that he started. Or you could realize that no one has ever seen someone come out from being dead. And everyone standing there is like, is this of God, or is this like a demon, and is it really Lazarus, or is it some other like shadow dwelling? Like, who is this? They might not want to touch him. They might want to have nothing to do with Mary and Martha and the family ever again. But Jesus says, go and unbind him. I'm not going to do it for you. Community has to go and experience the truth of this moment. And so everyone goes, and they begin to unwrap Lazarus. And I think that's one of the most powerful moments of this story, is that Jesus sends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus a community. Because you might think that Lazarus being raised from the dead is the end of everybody's trouble, but it's not. Lazarus is back from the dead, and that's beautiful for Mary and Martha, but what has that man been through? Where has he been? What is his experience? Who is going to process that with him? Meanwhile, the authorities catch wind of this, and they're angry, and now they want to kill him again. So nothing like resuscitation to then have death threats made to you, right? It's heavy stuff. And the processing of that whole thing. And the next time we meet Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, Lazarus is reclining with Jesus at the table, and Mary and Martha are throwing a party that the whole community is at. See, it worked. They unwrapped Lazarus, and then they've filled in around the family. Even while the death threats are being made, even while problems are happening, there are people there. And I wonder if that's not also a kind of paradigm. That when the world shifts, when the thing takes our before life and our afterlife, we don't have to do it alone. God shows up in the middle of it, and God shows people up around us. Too often we act like we have to walk through life by ourselves, or that the spiritual journey is simply just ours, and that no one can walk with us along the way. Have you seen the recent statistics for loneliness in America? It's tragic. I mean, one of the reasons listed for why in this industrialized, developed country, life expectancy is going down is loneliness, lack of community. God sends people into our lives. It's the power of this story. Yes, Jesus shows up, and then Jesus says, I got to leave, but you got all these people. And they will unwrap you. They will unbind you, and they will let you go. I think it's not just literal, I think it's pretty metaphoric. Someone has got to unbind what happened to Lazarus. Someone has to help him be free of whatever that was, and help the family also. And I think that there's truth in that. My little November story, that day was grim. A couple weeks later, I found myself outside on some steps doing some work. And there were some wonderful people sitting there. And we just struck up a conversation. And you know what? I would have never guessed. But it's amazing when you open yourself to what might be in the present. That those people, they didn't know it, but in being present to me, they began to unbind me. By opening my heart to the other, by choosing not to be alone, by choosing not to live in the past and to accept that I didn't have any easy answers about where I was or what I was doing, I suddenly had people around me. And so I think when life deals us, or the choices we make, or the tragedy that befalls, and what was and who we were is not who we are and what our present is, we're not alone. God comes to us in the midst of it. Maybe in ways we don't expect, maybe in ways that make us mad, maybe in ways we don't quite understand in an answerless way. But the promise of Jesus is that we see the glory of God in the present. Jesus' resurrection and life now, not just in the future. And part of the way we see that is through the people around us. And it is my prayer and my hope that as people of God, we trust one another, we trust people in our lives to help unbind us. And that maybe this is also our work in the world, to help unbind people. It's a ministry of accompaniment and presence and aliveness, of solidarity. When we find ourselves as Martha, as Lazarus, perhaps as the people in the story, may we find the courage and the hope and the trust and the love of God to make our own confession. And may we realize that the glory of God may be showing up in the faces of the people around us. Above all, you are never alone. The power of God goes with you and around you and before you. And people, at least these people, are here for you. May it be so.